My session today is the defensive design of integration pipelines. I'm really wanting to help you think about how to make your SnapLogic pipelines more robust when you deploy them into a production environment. It's not going to be a deeply technical session. This is something that everybody can do. Remember the ease of use ethos that comes with using SnapLogic. To get into it, defensive programming, it's something that I learned about many years ago when I was a programmer. And it's the idea of designing any sort of system in a way that you try to ensure the continuing function under any unforeseen circumstances. Okay, trying to stop things going wrong and bringing down your integrations. The interesting thing about this is, though, that there's also a paradox. Whilst you're developing pipelines or any code in general, you really want to know about these errors. You want them to get picked up. You want to see that there's something wrong so you can work on it. And we'll have a look at how we can actually do that in SnapLogic shortly. And I love this comment here. You want it to be obnoxious at this stage. But once you get into production, you want any error to be as unobtrusive as possible. You want the program to recover or fail gracefully. And we'll look at some different options for doing this. So if we think about error handling in SnapLogic, we've got a few options. The primary ones are actually catching errors at the snap level. You may have seen this already. And we can do a few things here. We can stop the pipeline from running. And again, this is fantastic when you're developing. Rather than processing maybe 1,000 rows of data, if it fails on number one, you want to know about it straight away so that you can start dealing with it rather than having to wait for your entire pipeline to finish. We can just discard the error. There may be some scenarios where you say, well, okay, we expect there to be some exceptions coming through here, and we're happy to just drop them. Okay, it might be bad data. We're quite happy that if that happens, we're going to drop these errors and we're just going to carry on processing. Probably the most useful, though, is actually routing the error to an error view. And you may have seen this kind of construct already in SnapLogic. And that's what we'll be taking a look at shortly. Now, what we try to look at is catching any error that we can anticipate. And this is where this error view is great. If we know that there could be an error with our SQL Server Select in this example, then we want to take steps to make sure that that error is handled in some way. That could be, in this instance, it could be that we say, well, let's say we're processing a large table or a large database, and we're transitioning it to a different system. And there may be some instances where there's foreign keys there. So if you try to upload a new record and the foreign key doesn't exist, that record doesn't exist in a different table, then you're probably going to get an error. In these circumstances, what we can potentially do is say, well, actually, rather than just throwing an error or reporting an error, how about we queue this record until later? Maybe put it on Kafka or something like that, as we heard Siemens are using extensively. So maybe we put that record onto Kafka, and then once we've processed everything, we go back to this remedial queue, and we start processing the records from there again, which by now, because everything else has been pushed into the target system, there's a better chance of it being handled this time. And we can maybe set things up to iterate through that a few times if necessary. But there's also going to be situations where we can't imagine that there's going to be an error. So how do we deal with that? Well, this is where the pipeline level error handling comes in. And we can specify an error pipeline, which is kind of like a catch-all. And I think of this, because I come from a traditional programming background, I think of this like a try-catch block. Okay, so I'm trying to execute on my code, which has got my defensive error routing in there. But with the best will in the world, I could still miss something, in which case I want to catch that. And at the very least, I want to either send an email or at least log a file somewhere. One thing to note, though, is if you are using an error pipeline, it changes the default snap error behavior. Okay, so where the default is to stop the pipeline, once you configure an error pipeline, the default becomes to pass that error to the error pipeline. And one other thing that's worth mentioning, but is actually a little bit beyond the scope of the demo today, we also have resumable pipelines. So they can be configured so that if you have an error that needs some sort of intervention, the pipeline effectively pauses it. You can then go away, you can mitigate the error, and then you can resume the pipeline from where it left off. So that's another option that you could look at. Anyway, we've had enough slides for today. How about we actually take a look at the platform? So I have a fairly simple pipeline running here. We've got a SQL Server Select, which is pulling some sample customer data down. And you can see I've got some fields in here, okay, including first name, which is what I'm looking for here. If I validate this, this should validate fine. Everything's good. We've got our data coming through. We're looking for unique records and no duplicates. So what we get out of this, first name, last name, and email address. That's all good. What if, though, we were expecting a name field rather than a first name field? Okay, if I validate this now, remember at the moment I'm in my development mode. So I might be passing in some data into this, and I can see straight away that I've got a problem here. Okay, it's telling me that effectively the name isn't, the where clause isn't valid. So I could look into that. But if this was in production, this would now be tripping me up. So what I want to do is go to the views and decide what I'm going to do here. As we mentioned, I can discard the error and continue, or I can route it to an error view, and that's what I'm going to do right now. So what would happen now if we validate this? We can see that the pipeline is now valid. I have this path up here where I could handle this error. And specifically, I have quite extensive data here available to me that I could potentially use to decide how to handle this. Okay, so maybe certain exceptions come back, we can handle it automatically. But with this particular error, we just want to log that. So that's handling it with an error view. I've got the same thing here. This is looking now at the pipeline level. Now again here, we've got that same mistake in here. We've got name rather than first name. Honestly, in the real world, I would anticipate that and probably handle it with an error view rather than error pipeline. But for the sake of this demo, you can see I've configured an error pipeline. That error pipeline takes some parameters, and these are dynamic parameters that are available down here. You can see we've got all the pipeline related parameters. So the label is the pipeline name. We've got the run UUID. We've got the start time, and we've got the project path. So all of these make it easier if I'm coming into the dashboard later on to try and review this to identify the specific execution. So if I was to execute this now, I'll just quickly fire up my email whilst this is running. You can see it didn't give me an error. Okay, it carried on processing because I had an error handler built into my, my pipeline there. And what I have received is an email here with all of the details that I would need. You can see I've got the runtime ID, I've got the label, okay? And all of this is simply coming from my, my shared error handling pipeline here. This is where it sent my email. You see it's formatting the data, and then it's actually building an HTML body in the email. And it's also writing out a log file to me. And the log file actually has the run ID in there as well. So I've got that additional information should I need it. So let's just summarize what we've talked about today. This is a huge topic. It's difficult to cover it in just 15 minutes, but we've talked about the error handling at both the Snap level and the pipeline level. Remember, we also have the option of resumable pipelines, which might be something that you want to talk to us about after today's event. The real key, though, is to think about this defensive design. And if the one thing you take away from my session today is that you think about being defensive when you're designing your pipelines, then it was definitely worth you coming in here. I have put some short links here to documentations. If you want to quickly take some screenshots, then you can get to the documentation for creating error views and error pipelines just there. And my contact details are also here. You can reach out to me via the chat within the platform once the session is finished, and we can speak that way. We can video chat if you want to. Otherwise, my details are on there.